Hello and welcome to this BlenderCookie.com tutorial. My name is Kernon Dillon and this is the final part in the Pup Tent tutorial. And in this part we're going to use procedural textures for the different aspects of the tent. And then we'll go to a 2D paint application and use our reference image and extract parts of that to create our background image for our scene. And then back in Blender we'll add a ground aspect to the scene and then use Blender's particle system to create the grass. And then we'll want to separate things into their own render layer and then bring that into Blender's compositing nodes so that we have control over each aspect of the scene when we do a little bit of color correcting. And then we'll render out our final image. So let's get started. Okay, here we are in Blender, and I think the first thing we want to do is turn on render simplification, since we're going to be adding a lot of things to the scene that will dramatically increase the render times. And this will help get us a little bit more speed in our renders. And we'll start off with the tarp by adding a little bit of a simulation of dirt on the surface. And this will be very simple. We're just going to use a clouds procedural texture. And so we go to our texture panel, add a texture layer or channel. We'll call it dirt, and we'll set it to be a clouds procedural. Increase the size, increase the contrast, and then increase the noise depth. And then back in the material buttons, we'll Control C to copy from the color swatch, and then Control V to paste it so that it gets applied to the cloud procedural. And then we darken that a little bit, and it has an appearance of adding a little bit of dirt and grit to the surface. And all we want to do is just make sure that the surface isn't just entirely the same color. And we can turn this down a little bit. We don't want to overdo it. Okay, and that's it. Okay, now that we've got our tarp just a little bit dirty looking, let's now work on the rope. We want to give the impression that there's more going on than there really is, because really the surface is just perfectly smooth and the same color. So again, let's add a texture channel to its material, and we want to use a wood procedural so that we can break up the pattern of color. And we'll Control C to copy the color from the base material on the rope. And then for the secondary color that's going to be used by the procedural, we want to make it an offset so that we have a nice alternating pattern that simulates the twisting of rope, or the appearance of twisted rope at a distance. Now let's turn that down so we can really see the difference, what's really going on. And then in the map input panel, we can increase the scale factor to get the smaller size of the pattern. Okay. And then let's go back and get our color the way we want it. Okay, and now you can see that's starting to look a little bit rougher than it did before. And it's just really a matter of just giving the perception that there's more going on there than there really is. Okay. And since this isn't going to be seen close up, it really doesn't matter that we're just faking it. So that should work out fine. And I just wanted to adjust the colors here. Okay. And that's it. Okay, now we want to work on the framing for the tent. And this is going to be basically tree branches. And so we want to think about bark. And we're going to use procedurals as well. We're going to create several layers of texture channels using cloud procedural materials or textures. And we want to start with the part that I'm thinking of as being called the bark mid part. And this would be something between the actual base wood, if you were to strip away the bark, and the outer part of the bark, which would be the darker part that's really raised. So this would be sort of in between the cracks. And this is really just a lot of the same thing, just adding a clouds procedural, adjusting its scaling along the x-axis so it's thinner, and then adjusting the contrast so we can break it up some more. And then we want to, again, paste the color from the base material and then create an offset color so we get some contrast between the base material and the actual effect that we're getting from the clouds texture channel. And we create another one, and now we're thinking about the outer part of the bark, which is going to be the darkest part. And so it's all about the perception of it and not about the accuracy of creating a bark material, because again, these are going to be really small, and so you really just want to focus on how it's going to be perceived. And now I'm using assigning this to a normals channel as well, and I have two different ones, one for it having it extruded outward, and then one where it's pushing inward, just to give some difference between the mid part and the outer part of the bark. And now I don't know what to call this channel. I just added it because I think it needs a little bit more noise. And so we use another clouds procedural and we scale it down really small, and that's a good way to get a noisy texture. And we just want to add another color element to this. Okay. And I know this is flying by, but really it's really simple if you've done any kind of materials in Blender. So it's really just about experimenting and really recognizing what you're trying to do, what you're trying to copy in your reference, and just focusing on that as opposed to focusing on it being so physically accurate. And now I just want to tweak this branch here just to give it a little bit of a kink so it looks a little bit more natural. And now I'm just looking at each texture channel, thinking about the colors and how they're blended between each other. You can adjust that with the color slider there. And that's it. Okay. And that, from that distance, which is pretty much as far as we're going to get in the scene, is good enough. Okay, now we want to look at adding a background to our scene. And we want to get rid of the foreground and use the background in our reference. And we'll do that in a paint program. Okay, I'm here using Serif Photo Plus, and it's very similar to Photoshop and the GIMP. And I'm duplicating a background just so I can have a backup copy. And I want to freeform select everything I want to delete and then delete it. And then I'll make a backup copy of what we're going to be working with just in case I need to get back to that. And we're going to use basic cloning techniques where we sample one part of the image or another image and then paint it into our target image by cloning those sections from one place to another. And one thing you want to consider when you have an image like this where you've got a lot of little details is that you want to sample different areas frequently. Otherwise, it's very easy to start to see the pattern of cloning across the image. And you can do larger areas and then break those larger areas up by dabbing in clone sections from several different places in the midst of that larger area that you cloned. And that's a good way to just break up the pattern. And to me, this is fun. I mean, because you get to take one image and turn it into something else. These techniques are the backbone of a lot of matte painting techniques and camera mapping. So it's very useful to spend some time doing this and learning how to do it. And you also want to think about the contour of what you're cloning. You don't want to clone something flat or at an angle that's different from where you're trying to create a new section. And a lot of times that's hard to not do. Sometimes you just have to actually paint in what you want and then clone over top of your painting or do a mixture of the two. But we're just going to do basic cloning here. And I'm trying to think about how I want this hill to resolve. And what I'm going to do with the road, I think I'm just going to run that into the hill and let the hill block it. And we're just cloning a lot of little sections just to break up the patterns there. And I think I'm going to, there's a little dirt pathway here, a little road. I think I'm going to take it up. I don't want to take it all the way up to the main road there. So I'll just stop it somewhere and figure out how I'll do that when I get there. And flat areas like this can be kind of difficult because you really need to think about patterns starting to become visible. And so you just sample a lot from different areas. Okay. I think that works. Bringing some of the details over from the far side of the field to the forefront. And let's extend the trees down, and then I think I'm going to have this path extend over to the left side as well. Okay. And I think I'm just going to let that hill drop off right there, and the foreground that we create in Blender will cover it up. And that's pretty much all we're going to do. And we just want to export it, save it under a different name, and then back in Blender, let's load that just to take a quick look at it. Okay, and that's going to be our background. So now we need to do two things to really get this to work for us, and that is we want to add it to our viewport so we can see it as we position things around in our scene, and we can know how they're going to render relative to that background. And so in the 3D view, we'll just go to the view menu and view properties. No, I want to go to the background, sorry. Go to view and then background and add a background image. And since we already have that image loaded, we can find it in the drop down list. Okay. And we want to turn the blend all the way down so we get the full opacity of the image. And when we view in the camera view, we'll see it as though, that's our actual background. Of course, it's not going to move. When we move the camera around, it's going to be stationary. But this will allow us to see and interactively orient our scene relative to our background image. Now, when we render right now, we won't see that background, so we need to set it up so that this image will be used in the background of our image. And we do that in the Scene Buttons window on the Output panel, where we specify an image we want to be used as a back buffer. And so we enable that by clicking the checkbox there, and then we load our image. And if we do a render, we'll see our scene with the background image that we loaded. Okay. And that's it for setting up our background image to be integrated with our scene. Okay, now we've got our background. We want to work on our ground area. And we'll add a grid and get it scaled and situated the way we want. And then I want to subdivide this using subdivide fractal so that we get some variation, subtle variations in the surface. And then we want to circle select everything around the camera that's not going to be visible, just so we can minimize the memory requirements. And in sculpt mode, we just want to break up the edge here and create some contour that it's going to work well with our little scene here. Again, cleaning up any excess. And I'm smoothing out some of these little bumps. Alright, and there's our render without any materials. And I just want to orient this just to play around with the different camera angles. And keeping in mind the cutoff point in our background where it turns to black. And we want to make sure we have that covered up. I probably could have done a better job of extending that down further. It would make it a lot easier. And now we just give a basic texture channel using an image of dead grass. And we want to use that as a base layer underneath our grass that we're going to create. Alright, and now we are in the particles. We add a particle system. We set our initial amount, and we need some initial velocity so we can see our particles. And we're using the hair type of particles. That's what we're going to need for grass. And we want to randomize and add a little bit of Brownian motion to it, just so we don't have straight pieces. And we can control the percentage of particles that we see in the 3D view with the display parameter. And we want to turn on the emitter so we can see our emitter, and we increase our length to 1 so we can get random lengths. And then we enable B-spline for smoother strands, and then strand render. When we do our render, we can see that we're getting color from the material because we have the particle set to use material 1. So let's create a new material for this ground object, and we'll call it grass. And we'll delete the other texture because it's really a duplicate of our other texture. And make sure we set our particles to use the second material. And now we do another render, and we see our grass has no color to it at all because we haven't added any material, any texture to it. So now let's add a texture for the grass. And we'll use a grass image here. But it doesn't quite match what you'd expect based on the background image that we're using from the reference. So we'll just color correct it a little bit. And we'll probably have to do more of this in the composite nodes, but I think it's a good idea to at least address it at this point as well. And we're just thinking about the fact that there's a lot of blue sky there. And it's not a very bright day. Okay. And then we just save this. Make sure we give it a different name so we have our original intact. and then load this back into Blender. And then I think that's a better match, at least as a good starting point. And we can see our grass particles are starting to use that texture. And let's scale that texture down so we get a little bit more better coverage. And now let's increase the amount of particles and turn down the display percentage. And now we want to use children particles, which will create children particles for each particle strand that's in the scene, and allows us to more efficiently have a lot more particles in the scene. And we can tweak the rough parameters, which will change the actual shape of each strand. And a lot of times when you're doing this, you might want to turn down the number of particles temporarily just to keep the interaction a little bit more acceptable. Okay. And this is really just about a lot of tweaking, so I can't say that these are the settings you need to use, so it'll require some experimenting. And I'm setting the children particle to use faces so they don't tend to clump together. I just don't want that sort of look for this. And that's our starting point for the grass, or pretty much our ending point. We also need to add some shadows underneath the tent, and so we'll work on that next. Okay, now we want to add a spotlight and position it, and we're going to use this to create our shadows underneath the tent. And I'm using the W key to bring up the little lamp tools menu. That's pretty handy. And we want to set the light to be only shadow, and that's going to be key to getting this to work the way we want to. And this way we can control the amount of shadow without having to worry about how bright the scene is being made by this light as well. Okay, and I turned off the little lamp inside the tent that I had earlier. I don't think I'm going to be using that. And now I'm thinking about how I want the shadows to fall, and that's causing me to position the lamp accordingly. And I just turned off the particles on the ground plane. There's no point in having them still visible at this point because we're pretty much done with them. And so you can relieve your computer from a lot of extra work by just turning them off. For the 3D view, they'll still render as they were before, but you just won't have them on inside the 3D view. And I'm still trying to get a better position for the camera, and also being sure to adjust the end here so it doesn't expose any of the unpainted areas in our background image. And I'm in sculpt mode, by the way, and I'm also dragging this to get it back outside of the camera's view. And I press Shift B and selected the entire area of the camera view, and that essentially turns off the border render. And I think I'm going to turn off render simplification and just go for a full render. We can see we have our shadows in place. Okay. And at this point, I think I don't really like that right there, but I'll deal with that later. At this point, we want to start breaking things down into their own render layers. Okay, before we get into the render layers, I still want to adjust this camera a little bit just to expose that little dirt road in the background on the left-hand side a little bit more. Okay. All right, that's good enough. And now we want to separate everything into different render layers, but first we need to make sure that everything is on its own render layer according to how we want to organize the scene. So the ground, we want to put it on layer 2 by itself, and on layer 1 we have the tent, and on layer 20 we have the camera and the lights and I'm going to delete that little light that was inside the tent earlier. So we enable all the layers, and then in the render layers panel, we'll call the first one sky and disable everything except for sky, and only enable the layer with the camera in it. And we create a new render layer and for the ground, and that's on layer 2. So we disable the sky and only enable layer 2 and layer 20 for the camera. And same thing for the tent, layer 1 and layer 20 for the camera, and disable sky. Then we turn on do composite and go to the composite nodes and bring in our render layers. And then we set each render layer node to the separate render layers. And of course we need the composite and viewer node to get any output. And now we want to combine the render layers, but let's first get a good solid render. And now we see that we're just seeing the sky, and now we just have the ground with the shadow, and then we just have the tent all separated into their individual layers. And so now we want to combine the ground and the sky, so we use an alpha over node, and then we duplicate that alpha over node and then connect the output from the previous combination and then connect the tent. And so we now have those two layered, and now we have everything composited together. Okay, and now with everything separated, we have the advantage of being able to add an RGB curves node in between each one of these, and we can do all sorts of things to get the look that we want, so that the different layers and the different elements can work together better to create a complete scene. And I'm just adjusting the saturation level on this grass because it's too much, and I think it needs a little bit of blue as well. Okay, so this is a great way to isolate things without having to go to an external application. You can do it all right here inside of Blender. Okay, and we want to make sure we connect everything out to our composite output node so we can get a final render. And if I had to do it all over again, I think I would spend more time on just the layout of the land, but I just wanted to give a good demonstration of the workflow of how you can take a model and then extend that to just integrate it into a simple scene, and using your parts of your reference image as well. And I'm just organizing the layout of these nodes here. All right, and that's pretty much it. Hope you've learned something. I know it went by pretty fast, but a lot of it's very simple and a lot of repetition and a lot of tweaking. But hopefully you got something from it. And that's it. Thanks for watching.